Then it was time to evaluate the forensic work in the case. Upstairs at the murder scene, there were at least 25 Fort Worth cops inside the mansion, and possibly that many outside. By some estimates, there were maybe 80 cops at the scene. Nobody seemed to know for sure. Racehorse said this:
"The same thing that made this a big case in the press prevented the cops from doing a good job at the scene. It happened in the big house on the hill. They were running around ogling the place and guessing at his wealth. The crime scene people didn't do a damn thing. They didn't check the rug under Stan Farr's body for the presence of other stains. They didn't explain the various blood type stains, such as those on the windows. They didn't explain all the fingerprints. They didn't even bother to fingerprint Stan Farr's shoes. Here we have a lady claiming someone pulled him by his feet, and nobody took fingerprints of his shoes. What they did, they accepted the first version handed down and did just enough forensic work to corroborate that version."
For 2 days, Haynes cross-examined Detective Greg Miller using sections of the Fort Worth Police Department crime scene manual to suggest that the officers were sloppy in gathering evidence. Haynes questioned Miller about bloodstains that were not scraped for crime lab analysis and areas of the mansion not dusted for fingerprints. Regarding the discovery of Bev Bass's sandals, Haynes asked the detective, "What person was it who delivered the shoe to you?" "It wasn't a person," Miller had to admit. "It was a dog." "A dog?" Racehorse arched one eyebrow at the jury as if to ask, "Did you hear what I heard?" One of the dogs running loose around the mansion had located the missing sandal and turned it over to police. Later, Haynes produced a crime scene photograph showing an unescorted dog inside the mansion breakfast room, wandering freely among such evidence as the bloodstained telephone, cigarettes, and a glass. The photograph showed a policeman in the background looking disinterested in the dog's activities. At the next recess, Haynes told the news reporters, quote, "No wonder there was a dog carrying shoes around. The police weren't interested. How would you like to be charged with murder and have dogs walking around the crime scene and smoking cigarettes?" Prosecutors then asked to inspect the document Haynes had used in his cross-examination of Miller. Pages photocopied from the Fort Worth Police Department crime manual, which Haynes claimed proved the investigators were negligent in gathering evidence. Haynes refused to surrender the document, noting that it had been offered as a defense exhibit but not entered into evidence because of objections by the prosecution. Quote, "They can't have their cake and eat it too," Haynes told the judge. Moments later, Joe Shannon accused the defense of altering the police document by Xeroxing out a section of the manual that says search officers may use discretion at a crime scene rather than relying on the manual as a rigid set of rules. Shannon charged that Haynes's cross-examination, quote, "left the unfair impression that this officer has not followed the manual when in fact they have deleted that part which shows this witness acted properly," quote. Haynes came out of his chair like a man shot from a cannon, calling Shannon's comment, quote, "a gross and scurrilous accusation." The defense attorney demanded that the judge instruct the jury to disregard Shannon's remarks, but the judge refused, pointing out that the defense had been instructed not to read from the document in the first place. When the jury had been excused for the day, Burleson made a formal motion for a mistrial. The judge denied it, to the great relief of both sides. When the court took a recess, Cullen moved freely among his admirers, shaking hands, posing for pictures, talking football or finance. His people even installed a telephone in the judge's outer office, and it was common to see him making business decisions on the phone. The housewives loved his aura of power and the plain-spoken, almost boyish manner that went with it. There was a nice dark-haired young lady who enjoyed getting Cullen in the corner and discussing sociology. And there was a stream of young beauties, most of them from Dallas or Fort Worth, brought in by Cullen's people, who frequently sat in the seats behind Cullen. They shared catered lunches with Cullen and Karen, and at night visited the better clubs around town, like the Hilton Inn or Rhett Butler's. One striking young woman was Rhonda Sellers, a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader and the former Miss Metroplex of Dallas-Fort Worth. Rhonda was the daughter of one of Karen's best friends. Cullen had sponsored Rhonda in the Miss Texas pageant. Members of the jury probably didn't know her name, but they would not forget her face. She was for Cullen Davis. It seemed unthinkable that this lovely, wholesome young woman would support Davis if he were a cold-blooded killer. Race had promised his oldest son, Blake, a 16-year-old starting linebacker for the Houston Kincaid High School team, that he would attend the father-son night football game, whatever the cost. As he hurried to catch the afternoon plane to Houston, Haynes had to feel that the trial was going well. If he couldn't yet read the jury, as he claimed, he could certainly decipher the mood of the community. Those who weren't pro-Cullen were at least anti-Priscilla. A month after Priscilla's testimony, people still spoke of her in tones normally reserved for vermin. Judge Dowland's own secretary seemed unable to bring herself to speak Priscilla's name, referring to her as that woman, and had joked that she might write her own book about the case and call it Silicone and Sex. That's how she saw the issues. On one occasion, a deputy left Cullen alone in the jail booking office. When the telephone rang, Cullen looked around, saw no one, then answered it himself. No other prisoner would have tried that, but Cullen knew he wasn't just any other prisoner. The capper came the first week in October when Cullen was observed talking privately with the mother of juror Marilyn K. Hastley. Her daughter had been sequestered since June 29th, but like the other jurors, she had been permitted telephone calls and visits by her family. The visits were supposed to be monitored by bailiffs, but that didn't turn out to be the case. Now it came out that married jurors were being allowed conjugal visits, unsupervised, naturally. Prosecutor Tim Curry was livid. The prosecution heard rumors of conjugal visits, but nobody could confirm them. The judge kept rolling his eyes and turning away. There was nothing for the state to do but proceed with its case. The conjugal visits were the worst thing that happened to us, Curry said later, because of the talk of the case between the insider on the jury and the outsider who was against Priscilla. If it had been the other way around, Curry said, it would have been sure grounds for reversal. But what can you do? The state doesn't have a right of appeal. When you leave the state without that lever, then the judge can do anything he wants to, Curry said. Later, it was time to cross-examine Bev Bass, an eyewitness on the night of the murders. For the next hour or more, Haynes led the witness over an almost minute-by-minute account of her activities before and after the murders, pressing her for exact times and places, who did what and went where. Racehorse had a large blackboard brought into the courtroom, and as Bass answered each question, Haynes listed the answers chronologically in chalk, easily visible from the jury box. Every time the witness said, "I don't remember," Haynes wrote IDR on the blackboard. Soon there was a long list of IDRs for the jury to see, a list that would remain visible throughout the trial. Just as the prosecution had dressed the table with the bloody clothes of Stan Farr and Andrea Wilborn, Haynes had his own props and his own method of dressing the stage. Racehorse wanted to trip up the witness with her own deposition. He said, "So on October 16th, 1976, you didn't say that you told the man, Officer Sawhill, that Cullen Davis had shot your boyfriend, did you?" Bass: "No, it was my first deposition, and they didn't ask me things in as great detail." Haynes: "You were trying to be truthful, weren't you, ma'am?" Bass: "Yes." Haynes: "Well, the fact is you don't really remember what you told the man in the car, do you? You either said it was Cullen Davis or the man who owns the big house on top of the hill, didn't you?" Bass: "I don't remember which." Haynes: And now you remember. Your memory has improved, has it? Bass, I just now calmed down where I can sit down and remember it. Haynes had another statement, the one that Bass made to Detective Davis in the early morning of August 3rd. Passing close to the jury box to make certain he had everyone's attention, Haynes read a passage in which Bass stated, quote, "While we were walking on the walkway, I heard loud noises coming from inside the house. I heard a woman scream. I think I heard one shot. A man was walking in front of me and Bubba." Then Haynes looked over the rim of his semicircle reading glasses as he phrased his next question.
Are you testifying now that the man in black was not walking with you and Bubba when you heard the shot?
Yes, sir.
So, what you said in the statement of August 3rd is not true.
It's out of sequence. Will you let me explain it?
You want to say that when Officer Davis typed it up, he typed it out of sequence?
If you are asking me if I am lying, the answer is no, sir, but you're making it very difficult for me to answer.
You say you heard a noise that sounded like a gunshot?
I'm not sure what kind of noise it was.
Bass became more frustrated, and Haynes appeared increasingly suspicious of her memory. At one point she said, "I have an explanation, if you'll just let me." "I'm sure you do," Haynes said, taking off his glasses and walking away from the witness stand, as if to say that he had heard all the lies he could stomach for one day. "I'm positive you do," Haynes finished. Several members of the jury smiled and exchanged glances, but Racehorse wasn't done yet. He continued to question her about the noise she claimed to have heard.
Are you saying that the noise was comparable to the sound of the gunshot?
What does comparable mean?
This time several jurors laughed out loud. It was Racehorse Haynes at his best. Then suddenly, without warning, Haynes slammed a briefcase on the table. You could hear the noise at the opposite end of the hall.
Comparable,
Haynes said, treating the witness now to his condescending smile.
Did that sound like a gunshot?
Bass didn't answer, but the look on her face said it did sound like a gunshot. Prosecutor Tolly Wilson asked a witness later, and when Cullen heard the results of the divorce judge's ruling, there was no reaction. Munn answered that he couldn't recall any reaction from either Cullen or Ken Davis. Certainly Cullen demonstrated no hatred, Munn repeated. Would you describe killing a child's cat in front of that child an act of hatred? The prosecutor asked before anyone could stop him. Haynes bolted out of his chair like his pants were on fire, angrily objecting to the question. Dowland called all attorneys to the bench for a cooling-off period. There was no doubt in Tolly Wilson's mind that the question was out of order, but he didn't regret it. It would very likely be the only time in the trial that Cullen Davis would be accused of any misdeed prior to the murders. This was vital to Haynes, to keep a clean image of Cullen for the jury. Racehorse's mentor, the great trial lawyer Percy Foreman, had once said, "If you can show the jury that the crime victim was the type of person to kick a dog, they might turn against the crime victim." Here, Tolly Wilson was using a Percy Foreman tactic against the defendant, showing he was the type of person to kill a cat. This was the whole case to Racehorse Haynes. The delicate balance of optics. Who does the jury like and who don't they like? Very important in deliberations. Since Priscilla Davis had already admitted that she was addicted to Percodan, later the defense called to the stand Dr. Robert Miller, a nationally recognized expert on dangerous drugs. He was a professor at the University of Minnesota and was currently studying opiates for the United Nations. At considerable expense, the defense had brought him to Amarillo to detail the evils associated with the habitual use of the opiate-based drug Percodan. The jury seemed especially attentive as Dr. Miller described the devastating effects of the drug on a person's memory, as well as that person's ability to perceive reality. When mixed with alcohol, Miller told the jury the drug had a potentiating effect. In other words, Racehorse Haynes prodded the witness, you have a situation where 1 + 1 = 3. That is substantially correct, said the doctor. Would that person who mixed Percodan with alcohol actually believe that a fictitious episode was true? Haynes asked. Yes, but it depends upon the individual. Some are more prone to do it than others. As Haynes hoped he would, Dr. Miller then introduced the term two-worlder to the jury, describing those people as the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so to speak, of the drug dependency field. They live in one world where they are relatively honorable members of society, and they live in another world where their behavior patterns are drastically different. Could such a person be a socialite and yet associate with criminal elements? Haynes wondered. Could you have a Mrs. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde? Haynes inquired for the benefit of the jury. I would agree to that, the good doctor said. I have no more questions, Haynes said. Later on, just when the jury and the prosecution expected Cullen Davis to take the stand and simply corroborate the alibi his girlfriend Karen Master had testified to earlier, Racehorse Haynes stood up, looked at Cullen, then at the jury, then at the judge, and announced, quote, "At this time, the defense rests." Shannon had guessed some weeks ago that the defense would not put Cullen on the witness stand, but Tolly Wilson and Marvin Collins were stunned. I can't believe a defendant would come to West Texas and not get on the witness stand himself, Collins said. If you're going to try to float an alibi, Wilson remarked, you sure as hell better take the witness stand. Racehorse claimed later that it was one of the hardest decisions of his career, but the consensus among defense lawyers was that Cullen is very poor witness material. He doesn't emote. It's doubtful he could look sincere and honest. A skeptic might argue that Cullen didn't have an alibi, but perhaps he didn't need one. Of the entire cast of characters who had appeared with their sordid tales of duplicity and foul deeds, the only one who remained a total stranger to the jury was Cullen Davis. The key phrase in Dowland's charge to the jury was reasonable and moral certainty. In order to return a verdict of guilty, the jury would have to have a reasonable and moral certainty that the defendant, Cullen Davis, committed the crime, to the exclusion of all other possibilities. In other words, if any one of the 12 had a reasonable doubt, it was that juror's duty to bring in a verdict of not guilty. Dowland allowed each side 3.5 hours for closing arguments. By law, the state would both begin and end the arguments, but each side was permitted to allocate its time according to its own wishes. Tolly Wilson opened for the state. Haynes turned over the first segment of the closing argument to the formidable lawyer, Mike Gibson. The lawyer who was honest as the day is long, he had no weaknesses. Some lawyers think they're going to beat him in a paper war. They find themselves snowed under. Some people think they're going to out-debate Mike Gibson in court. They don't realize the guy's been a high-level debater since junior high school. Gibson led off for the defense, surprising the jury, perhaps. Gibson pointed out that the state had called 23 witnesses, and the defense had called 44. And the sum of the testimony, quote, showed you the true color and character of Priscilla Davis. Just look at Priscilla Davis, Gibson challenged the jury. Quote, all those young people around her, massive amounts of Percodan, illegal drugs. Priscilla claimed her relationship with W.T. Rufner was platonic, but W.T. called it love. And why was W.T. trying so hard to get an alibi? Because he had a good idea who really did the killings, Gibson contended. He connected 3 pieces of seemingly unrelated testimony for the jury's consideration. 1, the allegation that shortly before the murders, Stan Farr was flashing a large roll of money. 2, the testimony that two of Ruffner's pals, Danny McDaniels and David Jackson, once watched Priscilla open the upstairs safe and take out a bag of cocaine. 3. And the fact that the killer had left the large plastic garbage bag upstairs where the safe was. David Jackson, or someone who did the killing, was going for that safe upstairs, Gibson claimed. He again reminded the jury of the many dope dealers and convicted felons who lived in the mansion with Priscilla. Quote, the flow of substances through that house and through that lady was phenomenal, Gibson said, shaking his head at the very idea of it. After Gibson finished, and the jurors probably expected to hear from Haynes, it was Phil Burleson who stood up to bat second. The calm and meticulous Burleson. He reminded the jury that neither Bev Bass nor Gavril knew who killed Stan Farr, only what happened to them. That someone was up there they thought was Cullen Davis. As for Priscilla, it hardly seemed reasonable that she could remember anything with all that Percodan and alcohol churning in her head. How many times have you heard the words, "I don't remember," from their witnesses, he asked. From their witnesses, not from ours. Burleson added that the absence of rebuttal witnesses by the state proves that our witnesses were truthful. We brought you the real facts. Priscilla had told the jury that when she first heard Bev Bass's voice in the driveway that night, she thought it was Dee. Burleson pounced on this. Why didn't she call out, "Dee, run," if she thought Bev Bass was Dee? Either she lied or she was totally unconcerned for the safety of her own daughter. Here is a woman so selfish, so concerned with her own self, she will do anything. Burleson reviewed the lies that Priscilla had told on the witness stand, then posed this key question. If she wanted you to believe this one thing, that Cullen did it, why didn't she tell you the truth about everything? When Burleson finished, the suspense grew for Haynes. Gibson led off with a single. Burleson smashed a double into deep right field, so now Haynes had runners on second and third. Ray stood up with thumbs in his vest and said, "They brought you the very best case they could, and it fell woefully short." Haynes told the jury that he had no doubt the state would accuse him of, quote, endeavoring to assassinate the character of their witnesses. I do feel sorry for the Bubba Gavrils of this world, but I do not forgive him for lying, nor should you. Because when you raise your hand to God, things like parents or peer group pressure mean nothing at all. No, the person I hold hostility against is Priscilla Lee Davis, that corrupter of young people, the Machiavellian influence behind this whole thing. Haynes then pivoted to the job done by the Fort Worth police at the crime scene. Isn't it odd? Isn't it curious? Don't you wonder why there was no picture of the bullet in the basement, if in fact the bullet was in the basement? Why didn't the prosecution call a single supervisory officer to testify? Why didn't they call Detective Davis, who was in charge of the case? Will you remember what happened when we called Officer Sodders? And why didn't they call Sodders? These are questions only the learned counsel for the state can answer. Haynes reviewed a long list of apparent foul-ups on the part of the investigators. About the only thing he could find for approval was the fact that they found none of his client's fingerprints at the murder scene.